Rare is the wine that spends more time in a barrel. Rare are the vineyards that flourish in a more harsh and unforgiving land. Rare is the grape that is harvested by hand and crushed by foot. The wine is port, and this is Ports to Remember, a discovery of port wine from the grapes to the glass. Come, savor the wine, harvest the grapes, get to know the place and the people whose lives have been wrapped in the joy of port wine for generations. Join your host, wine writer and connoisseur Tony Aspler, in this celebration of Ports to Remember.
Hi, I'm Tony Aspler and welcome to Ports to Remember. Now this may look like I'm in the middle of a cave, but in fact this is in the tasting room of Calem Port in Villanova de Gaia. The lodge is actually built into the side of the mountain, and we'll be tasting Calem Port and learning more about it. So stay with me. On the coast of northern Portugal, the city of Villanova de Gaia perches on the side of a steep valley wall. This is where the Douro River meets the Atlantic Ocean, and where you find the business of the port trade. The grapes grow 100 kilometers upriver, but this is where the wine is blended, aged, bottled, and shipped. Villanova de Gaia and Porto, the city across the river, form the commercial hub of Portugal. It's where I met Rogério Silva of the port house Calem. And Calem is an old company, and Rogério is quite new to the company, right?
Yes, you're right.
How come you came to acquire Calem?
Well, Tony, it was a bit of a history, say. Calem has been on the market for sale for a couple of years. A number of international groups had looked into buying the company. One of the most traditional Portuguese houses. Why don't we keep it in Portuguese hands? And luckily, Dr. Calem made an effort also on his side to leave it in Portuguese hands, although he had some interesting offers from other potential buyers. But I have to say that Dr. Calem was very kind, and he helped us to buy it from him.
I'd like to change the subject for a moment. What about oak? We talk a lot about grapes, but what is the role of oak in port?
The role of oak in port is not as important in other wines. For example, from the great wines from Bordeaux or California or other regions. We use oak barrels more as a container to age wines and help the oxidization process. As you know, port, the townies above all, the method of aging, it's by a bit of oxidization, contact with air. This brings up what we will call tertiary aromas. I don't know if my word in English was correct. So the role of oak, it's not really as important as other wines.
I've traveled every inch of the Douro, and I'm still amazed how you actually get the port from those remote quintas down to Villanova de Gaia.
Well, in the past, I'd say the river was the highway of the Douro. With the evolution of transport, then there was a period where the train played that role, and recently it's the tankers, the stainless steel tanks, which transport the wine.
Well, how do those big tankers actually maneuver around those bends?
On the more difficult parts, it's smaller vehicles with smaller tanks, say. And then, of course, you have the 25,000, 30,000 liter tanks which circulate from the major centers, say, to Villanova.
Can you tell me about the Calem style. Is there a particular house style?
Well, Calem, being a truly traditional Portuguese house, has a different style, certainly from the British houses. We have elegant, refined wines, maybe a bit lighter in style. The British will be a bit maybe fuller, but our side, on our wines, you will find refinement.
So the Portuguese prefer tawny and the British prefer LBVs and vintage.
We will go for more aged, elaborated, say, wines. Wines that through aging will become more elegant, more fine. The British, or say the Nordics, North people, maybe due to climate, they prefer heavier, fuller, richer wines. And I think this goes not only with port, but probably with other wines. I mean, in the south we go for lighter styles, where we try to combine elegance and refinement. And in the north it's more richer wines, I will say.
Certainly the finished product differs from one producer to another, but they all start out the same. Upstream from Vila Nova de Gaia, the Douro River and its tributaries have carved deep valleys through a hard and unforgiving landscape. On slopes a mountain goat would have trouble negotiating. Grapes for port have been grown for centuries. This is a wine-growing region unlike any I have seen anywhere else in the world. Its summers are incredibly hot and dry, its winters bitter cold and wet. What soil clings to these rocks seems too thin to support weeds, but it does grow grapes. In the Douro region above the Corgo River, called the Cima Corgo, Chief Viticulturalist Carlos Almeida shows me a newer planting method at Quinta da Perdiz, the farm of the partridge. These grapevines are planted horizontally across the hills, rather than the contemporary vertical planting style, which makes access easier for mechanical equipment. But here, the incline is too steep for vertical planting. The majority of the region is like this. And terrace walls that total hundreds of kilometers in length support narrow steps where the port grapes grow. In this rugged landscape, all the work is done by hand. Everyone in the region sets to work for the harvest. Individual grape-picking teams called rogas return to the same quintas year after year. There may be 3 generations of one family working together in the vineyard. The women cutting, the young generation carrying small baskets to the larger cesto vindimo, the loads to be carried by the men. The people work from sunrise to sunset, and preparing their noon meal is like feeding an army. The day in the kitchen begins long before the day in the vineyard. They've got to feed 50 or more by noon. For the workers in the field, any hammock is a chair. While they eat, they share stories of past harvests and the joy it brings them. And they also pass around the jug of wine. Workers at the quinta are fed from the same kitchen as those in the field. Simple, hearty fare, and lots of it. This is one quinta. There are hundreds of large wine farms and thousands of smaller ones in the Douro region. It's mind-boggling to think that the entire region is harvested in 3 or 4 weeks. Inevitably, a few bunches of grapes are left on the vine. They weren't ripe enough for picking, but today, on a beautiful autumn day, they taste delicious. The crisp air and crunchy leaves underfoot remind me of home. Even the shape and the color of the leaves is familiar.
It's like the maple leaves, you know?
Carlos Almeida and I follow the path of the grapes from the field to the adega, where they're processed. At Quinta da Perdiz, modern processing equipment stands across from ancient barrels where this farm's port wine begins its aging.
Nice color.
Last harvest? Can smell. Of course, at this stage, the alcohol it is not very well married with the juice, but it's a nice color.
Yes, absolutely.
Nice aroma. Yeah.
So that'll stay for 1 year in those barrels?
Yes.
At Calem's vinification plant at San Martino d'Anta, in the heart of the Douro Valley, the young wine is stored outside in cement containers. For obvious reasons, they're called mamas. They're lined with glass tiles or epoxy resin. Even a very young wine shows its character, so the tasting begins right away. In the spring, once it's shipped to the lodge at Villanova de Gaia, the master blenders decide how each young wine will age and what type of port it will become. Back at the Calem lodge in Villanova de Gaia, a practiced palate tastes a young wine and decides its fate. Stay with me. Ports to Remember will be right back. This is the nerve center of all port houses, the tasting room, where they select the wines that go into their different ports. And here we are at Calem, and we're going to see how Calem puts together its LBV and its Caleta, its single vintage tawny. Now the winemaker, Mr. Narciso Costa, is going to talk me through this operation here. Now, this is the Caleta.
Colheita, novo, dos mais velhos.
Narciso Costa explains that a late bottle vintage, an LBV, is the port of 1 year that is aged in barrel, in wood as they say, for at least 4 years and no more than 6. Sometime between 4 and 6 years, it's bottled, and both the year of the harvest and the year of the bottling are on the label. LBV is a vintage-dated ruby port. It's red in color and is sweeter and more fruity than the Caleta, which is a tawny port. A Caleta, which means harvest, is also made from grapes of a single year. Unlike the LBV, Colheita is aged in wood for at least 7 years. In fact, Colheita usually stays in the wood much longer than 7 years. In the cellars below the lodges, the barrels of Colheitas and others wait their time, gathering the dust of ages, like the bottles of vintage port.
These tools are called caões in Portuguese, and they're used in the port trade. Caões means dogs because of perhaps these metal pieces that look like teeth. What they are and what they're used for, you'll find out later in the program.
For some port houses, like Calem, the fact that their lodges are so close to the Douro River presents an interesting challenge.
Calem's lodge is set on the quay in Vila Nova de Gaia, and of course when the water rises, and sometimes it does, there are floodings in the cellar. Here we see that in 1989, on December the 22nd, the water level came up to here. In 78, up to here, and so on. The record was in 1909, when it actually reached that height. And of course, when water comes into the cellars, these barrels will float. Although they are impermeable, they're made of wood, they do float. And so in order to keep them in place, they are chained in position. When there are flood warnings, barrels like this are actually chained to the floor by means of hooks cemented into the floor like this.
Throughout the port trade, from the Douro to the lodges, I see tradition. The ways of doing things that haven't changed for generations. Despite the fact that many producers now prefer auto-vinification to the old-fashioned foot treading in the lagars, one aspect of the process is completely modern. Bottling is the only process in the production of port wine that is entirely up to date. And it's very noisy compared to the cathedral-like silence of the cellars. In these surroundings, I find another contrast. This very modern operation bottles some very old wines. Today, it's a white port. White port is becoming more popular in North America, and its popularity is growing fast. On the other hand, white port is very popular in Portugal, South America, and in Northern Europe. Tomorrow, they may be bottling a vintage, or maybe a Colheita. And if it isn't the full-size bottles, it will be these miniatures. I wonder how many people will take their first taste of port wine from one of these little samples I find everywhere in Porto, and how they will enjoy it when they get to know port better. I asked Rogério Silva his personal preferences.
When it comes to you as a well-known port producer and you go to a restaurant, are you expected to buy the best port?
I think the restaurant owner understands that we have different styles of port, and we have ports for every occasion and to suit, say, every ambiance, every dish.
One thing universal about the Portuguese: their food is hearty and plentiful. At the Dom Manuel restaurant in Porto, Rogério Silva and his guests finish their wonderful fish dinner with a vintage port. The decanter the waiter is using is called a ship's decanter. Its wide base makes it less likely to tip over when the ship rolls in a heavy sea.
Rogerio, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Tony.
Stay with us for more Ports to Remember. Well, you remember the dogs I showed you earlier in the program, the caons? Well, we're going to see how they are used in the port trade. I have two strong cellarmen here for the demonstration. Bravo, the dogs of port, and they've been used in the port trade for hundreds of years. Here we have a wonderful rainbow of ports, beginning with a white port, moving on to a young tawny, to an older tawny, this one is 20 years old, to a young ruby, and then on to an LBV, a late bottle vintage, and finally this really deep colored one, the vintage port. And I'm sure you'll be able to find one of these ports to your taste. When should you drink port? Well, I like to have white port as an aperitif before lunch or dinner. And of course, vintage port comes after dinner. Now, we have a ruby port here, and I enjoy ruby port either as an aperitif before a meal or with a meal. You can have it with chocolate, for instance. And tawny, well, tawny I like after lunch. LBV port. That stands, of course, for late bottle vintage, and this wine has spent about 4 to 6 years in wood before being bottled. Now, if you buy a bottle, you can store it for about a year before you open it. Once it's opened, consume it within 2 months. White port. When you buy it, you can leave it unopened for about a year. But once you've opened it, to consume it, it's best if you drink it within 4 months because it'll be fresh then. You've been watching Ports to Remember. Join me for the next program in the series.